In the studio, the Deputy Labor Leader, Richard Marles. Thanks for your time.
Morning, Tom. How are you? Annalise?
Very well, thank you. There's a lot of talk this morning about dinner in Canberra, which has happened before. It's happening again. How damaging do you think this is, that this splinter group is out there talking about coal and climate meeting to perhaps formulate to shift policy within the party?
Look, I think this is a total beat-up. I mean, you both know that on any given night in this town, there are groups of politicians having dinner. And surprise, surprise, at least on our side of politics, they talk about policy. Some emails get sent, end of story. I mean, there's really nothing in this at all. And you compare that to, what's going on the other side of politics, where the Nationals, who come to this first session of Parliament in the midst of a national crisis, in the midst of an international medical crisis, they spend their first day having a knock-em-down, drag-em-out fight over leadership within their party room, and then this week they take that fight to the floor of the Parliament. I mean...
Well, I don't think anyone's applauding that aspect, but you said end of story. It's my understanding Joel Fitzgibbon was summoned to Anthony Albanese's office. Doesn't sound like end of story.
I think this is, at the end of the day, people were having a dinner.
But why would he be summoned to the office if that's the case?
Oh, well, I mean, people have conversations all the time, and I don't exactly know what conversations happen between Anthony and Joel Fitzgibbon. Obviously, this was on the media last night. People discuss it. I don't think it's a big deal.
Were you a bit sad you didn't get an invite to the dinner?
There are lots of dinners which happen every night. I accept that I'm not going to be at all of them.
Well, moving on, there's some interesting news coming out about the South China Sea at the moment, in particular freedom of navigation exercises, and the US want to push for more of that, to have more control in that region. Would you support that?
Well, I think the principled point to make, and in a sense the only thing one can do from opposition is to give the principled point. I mean, I'm not aware of kind of the precise operational situation for Australian forces, but the principal point is this. As an island trading nation, freedom of navigation is fundamentally central to our national interest, and that's the case in the Straits of Hormuz, which is why it's the right thing for us to be participating in that project, but it's also right in the South China Sea.
So you met with Admiral Davidson yesterday, we understand, and so was that his suggestion that Australia should be conducting those freedom of navigation movements?
We didn't have that conversation. But, I mean, and it would be unlikely that we would have that conversation, in the sense that when you get to the operational questions as to when, where, how, necessarily that's a conversation that needs to be had with people who are in the chair of government. But the fundamental principle that freedom of navigation is an important thing to undertake around the world in the high seas, and that includes the South China Sea, is very important, and we support that.
Disappointing to see the US and the Philippines, their agreement formally ending in terms of defence cooperation. That's pretty troubling, isn't it?
Look, it does give me anxiety. There's a bit to play out here. We've seen a version of this, probably not quite to this extent, but we've seen a version of this in the past. Again, and this was a point that we made clear to Admiral Davidson, the American presence in East Asia is very important to Australia's national interest. And it's really important that continues. I mean, obviously in terms of Darwin and the marine rotation there, but throughout East Asia, in the Korean Peninsula, in Japan, and in the Philippines as well. So I think Australia's interest is certainly served by an active American presence, and I hope that issue with the Philippines is able to be resolved.
Would you support increasing that presence by having a US military base or missile battery on Australian soil?
Well, I mean, the whole question of missiles, I think, is not in the land of the real. That's not something that has come up, and I know that was tossed around when there was the Osmium conference last year in the media, but I don't for a moment think that was something that was a real request that was being made of the Australian government. In terms of the marine rotation, I think it is going really well. Certainly the Americans get a lot out of it. I know that Australia does as well. We from, it's a bipartisan thing, but from a Labor point of view, we have a sense of pride about this, of course, because it began under the Gillard government, and I hope it grows.
More problems emerging with the building of submarines here in Australia. I want to read this quote from Naval Group. "We didn't know the Australian market before we joined the program. Now we realise there is a lot more work to be done than we anticipated." That's pretty troubling. What was the bid process there?
It is deeply troubling. And what we need to understand here is that the way this program is playing out, at least as it's expressed by Naval Group there and also in the ANAO report that came out in January, represents a total breach of faith by this government to the people of Australia, the workers of Australia, and particularly the workers in Adelaide. This government promised to build 12 submarines in Australia. They promised to build them in Adelaide. Now we're hearing from Naval that less than half the content is going to be Australian. Now, that's not building them in Australia if mostly it's being built overseas. And that is absolutely not what this government committed. Christopher Pyne, when he was minister, talked about a 90% build in Australia. Now, this is a complete breach of faith. And it stands, I might say, in contrast to Collins, where there was a target of 70%, which was actually exceeded in terms of Australian industry content. And that was what Labor put in place during the Hawke-Keating years. Now, this is being fundamentally mismanaged. It ought to be an enormous concern to the Australian people. Of all the failures of government that we've seen on behalf of the Morrison government, particularly since the last election, this ranks right up there with the top of them. And we need to hear from the Minister about what on earth is going on.
Does there need to be a consideration of a plan B, whether it be Japan off the shelf, whatever it is? Is the project in that much trouble that needs to be a genuine consideration?
Well, what worries me, Tom, is that question, and you're not the only one asking it, is now being talked about in our media. Like, where's the Minister? This is, if you're looking at programs in Australia which are going to shape our strategic circumstances in the future, in a context where we face probably the most difficult set of strategic circumstances since the Second World War, the submarine program is first and foremost amongst them. So the idea that we're now getting to a point where this is being openly discussed, again, reflects a complete failure in government. Linda Reynolds has to come and explain to the Australian people what is going on. Like, can we have confidence that the most important program in terms of military procurement, is actually on track? And instead, like, I don't know where she is. And it's absolutely essential that we get answers to these questions. And necessarily, and this is not a criticism, that like this stuff happens behind a wall, and that we are talking about submarines. It's not a large part of this is not in the public domain, and I understand that. But it's all the more reason why you then need a government which is going to be out there explaining what is going on, so that Australian people can have a sense of confidence about this. This is the most expensive thing Australia has ever bought in any context since Federation. We deserve an answer about what is happening with our submarine program.
And just finally, we've had Jackie Lambie on just a short time ago. She said she's not going to talk to the government at all about ensuring integrity. Bill, now that they haven't released the Scations report, now I know how you feel about ensuring integrity, but do you think that this shows a breakdown in trust between the crossbench and the government?
Well, again, I think it shows a failure of government, and I think it does show a breakdown in trust between the government and the crossbenchers, and certainly we ought to be seeing that report. I mean, the Sports Rorts is an astonishing example of using public money for essentially to promote a political campaign in the lead up to the last election. We actually need to see what's going on here, and we've been calling for that. But again, this shows how the government is failing to manage its relationships in the Senate.
Where to from here? You tried the nuclear option, and it didn't leave the. I don't know what the analogy is here. What happens to a nuclear weapon? It didn't drop out of the plane or whatever. It hasn't worked.
Anyone?
Are we talking about sports rules?
Where to from here to try to get the Scations report? I'm confusing myself here. Where to for Labor from here? This option's failed.
Well, it's where to for the government. I mean,
we know what the government's doing. They're not releasing it.
Yeah. Well, I think everyone can understand what this Sports Rorts program was. I mean, this was a desperate attempt prior to the election to secure a re-election of the government, and they used public money to do it. Now, ultimately...
You don't really care if the report's released then?
No, well, I think the Australian people... We do care, and the Australian people care, and I think they want to have an understanding of what went on here, and I think they expect transparency from their government. But if the government failed to deliver that transparency, they will be judged accordingly by the Australian people, make no mistake.
Richard Marles, thanks for your time.